Hi, hello everyone. So this is the second video dealing with section 4.7, inverse trigonometric functions, but this is the second part where we deal with the cosine function or inverse cosine. So the notation, just as the sine inverse, is cosine inverse of x, and this again does not mean that the cosine is raised to a negative power. It's just a notation for the inverse sine function. Now, on the unit circle, you remember the y-axis is for sine, and then we range from negative 90 degrees to positive 90 degrees. Now, in order for us to get the cosine to be a function, we again have to restrict the domain because the inverse sine and cosine look like this, right? And they have multiple failures for the vertical line test. So in order to restrict the domain on the cosine, we will go from 0 degrees to pi or 180 degrees. So the cosine function is the x-axis. Okay, and we are going from 0 degrees all the way to 180 degrees. So the inverse cosine only exists here. Okay. Again, for all of the inverse functions, we are looking for an angle theta that is going to satisfy some value, as we've said before in the previous video. Now, for the known angles in the table down here, we have to know what they are. And for unknown angles, we would use the calculator. Okay, so here is the cosine, and we have to be familiar with these angles right here. Okay, so let's take a look. I have three examples, and I'll give you a couple more. Let's first look at this one. So for the positive values, it's very easy. In fact, here I'll give you another one. Cosine 0 degrees. I'm sorry, not 0 degrees, cosine 0. Not cosine 0, cosine inverse. Oops. Just erase this a little bit. So let's call this A1, cosine inverse of 0. Okay, so for the positive values, it's very easy. We just look at the table or we memorize the table. Okay, and then we can check with the unit circle right here. Now, let's do cosine inverse of 0. So we go to the cosine function and we see where we have the 0. Okay, because it's positive, you just pick the angle that is right here. This is 90 degrees. Let's check with the unit circle. Now, I said that the x-axis is the cosine axis. So cosine of 0 degrees is 1. And then as we move along this line, the cosine decreases until it gets to this point right here. Now, this point right here has what x coordinate? Well, the x coordinate is 0. So at 90 degrees, right? So we can say this, the cosine, you can say the cosine of 90 degrees is 0. You can check that on the calculator. And then as I continue moving, increasing the angle all the way up to 180 degrees, we find that cosine of 180 degrees is -1. So that checks. Okay, so here is cosine, right? 180 degrees -1. So the inverse cosine at 0 requires a 90-degree angle. And if I were to ask cosine inverse of -1, right? Obviously at 180 degrees. Now, for the negative values, we have to be a little bit more careful because the domain of the inverse cosine ranges from, as I said before, so domain of cosine inverse ranges from ranges from 180 degrees or from 0 to 180 degrees in this upper part. So let's take a look at values that are negative. For the values that are negative, I am in the second quadrant, okay? Because the values here have a negative x coordinate, right? So these are the negative values of cosine. So I have to adjust the angle. So let's do a couple. Let's do the positive value first, and then we'll do the negative. So imagine I gave you this question right here. Cosine inverse radical 2 over 2. So you go to the table or you memorize the table and you see it right here, radical 2 over 2, and you pick the angle 45 and then you be done. This is it for the positive. For the negative value, you can't write minus 45 degrees. This is wrong because minus 45 degrees will be here, right? This is 45 degrees. This will be minus 45 for the sine. But for the cosine inverse, you can't do that because there is no cosine inverse on this side of the curve, right? For this angle. The cosine only exists here. So you have to adjust the angle so that you are in the upper part of the circle. Well, how do we do that? Well, it is very easy. So here is x cosine x. Here was your 45 degree, but you're negative. So you're here. This is 45 degrees. So the angle that you need, and you know that this location is 180, the angle that you need is this one all from 0 to here, which is just 180 minus the 45. So it's always going to be 180 minus whatever angle, the positive angle. So in this case, erase that. 180 degrees minus 45 on 35. Okay, we cannot write minus 45 degrees. I've explained this before. Be very careful. Minus 45 would be here. This does not exist in the domain of cosine inverse. All right, let's take a look at this one. Imagine first I'm giving you the question cosine inverse radical 3 over 2. You would just go to the table, or eventually you will have the table memorized, right? And again, you only need to memorize these values here. In the case of cosine, it helps you to memorize the 180 also. So you go to where you find radical 3 over 2, and 30 degrees would be for the positive, right? Positive radical 3 over 2. For the negative, you know that you're in the second quadrant. So here's your 30 degrees. For the negative, you know that you are here. So the angle that you want, which is this angle, is the 180 minus the 30 degrees, which is obviously 150. So the answer that we need here is 150 degrees. Okay, so for the cosine on the negative values, so it's always 180 minus the positive angle. Okay, so similar to the sine inverse, but the cosine has domain 0 to 180, whereas the sine had it from minus 90 degrees to 90. So that we have to memorize. So this is the cosine inverse function.